95, if you have one of our study Bibles, down on the right hand corner. Just a little note, last week the class decided that after we did this, because my time with you is growing short, I'm in the teens in the number of Sundays, we will skip to Isaiah and do Isaiah and see if we can finish Isaiah while I'm here. If we finish Isaiah, we can go to something else. We can go to Proverbs or something, but we're going to go to Isaiah because people know Isaiah and like Isaiah, and it has, especially for people in the choir, it's meaningful, and so we'll do that. However, right now, we're going to take care of Ruth. Ruth is a really well-known book of the Bible. It jumps from what we've had about wars and kings and people who are in charge to a much more calmer, quieter thing. Even though it has some death in it, it is an interesting book, and I found out in my research that more study books have been written about the book of Ruth than any other book of the Bible. So I think that's interesting. It may be, and maybe you didn't know this, but I found this out, there are more Bible studies done by women than there are by men. So, and they like Ruth. So that is another reason. So, yes, sir.
They do, but Google doesn't. Because I've been able to Google every book and follow this. You Google Ruth, and what you get: Ruth Chris Steakhouse, you get Ruth Hamburg, you get
I have to go to a Bible site.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg,
Oh, that's bad.
Ruth Buzzy,
Oh, that's bad.
and not one word
Book
About the
of
book of
Ruth.
Ruth.
Book of Ruth.
Well,
I know.
Ruth Chris is an exceptional idea
Yes,
too.
yes.
We like, that's a good steakhouse. We'll go ahead and allow that in. Well, anyway, that's just a little background on Ruth. So let's begin with chapter 1 in verse 1. In those days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. Not surprising. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. We've heard of Moab many, many times. The name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. That's the key. Naomi, and the names of his sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem of Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. So they were from Bethlehem, we know that, and they went to Judah and to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. This was always a difficult thing in those days because, they were supposed to be provided, widows were supposed to be provided for by the family of the husband. And sometimes they were, and sometimes they weren't. But what happens here, it skips right to it. It says, they married Moabite women, her 2 sons, one named Orpah, thank goodness it wasn't Oprah, and the other Ruth. Here's the name we want, Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of the people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. When Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dad's husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." So Naomi is saying, go home to your mothers, back home to your original families, and may you find another husband. She then kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." So obviously she was a nice mother-in-law. And Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters." They said, "We will go back." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? I'm not gonna have, am I gonna have any more sons who could become your husbands?" Sort of a weird thought. "Return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand is turned against me." So, when death happened to widows in those days, as I told you, their plight was uncertain. And in this case, you haven't heard yet that Naomi had anywhere to go except home, where the Lord had been giving them food to eat. They were in a better position. In those days, if you'll recall, going back to Egypt, people moved where they had more food, where they could drink more water. They moved where they could live. And sometimes things dried up. We live in one of those places right now. And so places dried up, and if they didn't have someone to farm and to watch over them and to do all the things that they needed, these widows had to go somewhere they could live. And hopefully they had family there. So that's sort of a way that, and she's saying to these two daughters-in-law, "You've done well by your husbands. You've been with me, you've done well by your husbands. Now it's time to go back to your mothers and find new husbands who will take care of you." It wasn't hardly ever a love-based marriage in those days. Much like later on, as you've heard me talk about my fascination with the Regency period of England, a lot of times those lords and earls and dukes and all those people married for marriages of either a convenience, or they married women who had money, and their families wanted for them to have a title, so their grandchildren would be titled. The men who had these earls and lords and dukes who had these multiple castles and big places to keep up and all of this, and didn't have any money, because you see, in those days, I know I'm off a little bit, but in those days, the people like that were not supposed to work. They were not supposed to work. They were supposed to oversee their property, and the people who lived on their property, who worked, who gave them a portion of their money and kept a portion of their money for raising cattle and sheep and things like that, and wheat and all those things. It wasn't much different in Regency England than it is right now. Nothing much had changed, is what I'm trying to say, in all those years. Some people needed money and some people wanted a title. The big change came in those days when all the wealthy people in America, who from the East Coast to New York and the East Coast, who were manufacturers and people like that who had made a lot of money, wanted to go to England and trace their roots back, because remember, they were mostly all from England still by that time. So they wanted to go back, and they wanted their daughters to marry English lords and earls and dukes, and their grandchildren would then be royal. And they had the money, and the dukes and people needed it. So it was a marriage of convenience, but it was business. It was business. Unfortunately, a lot of the women, the girls, thought they wanted to marry for love, and so there was a fight, and that's why you have Regency romance novels. So there you have the story of the whole thing. I don't know what that had to do with this, except that it wasn't much different. That's all I'm trying to say. In all those years, not much changed. So they're talking back and forth, and Ruth replied, they said, "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and to her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you." So one of the daughters said, "All right, I'll go home." That was the other daughter. One of them said, "I'll go home." Orpah said, "I'm going to go home." But Ruth said, "I'm staying. Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Famous words from the Bible now. From where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Those are very famous, inspiring words from Holy Scripture. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, even if death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. Now, the whole town was, 200 people,
Yes.
And exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made life very bitter." Mara was the name for bitterness. His life made bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me, and the Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Very important. You know the story. Of course, you all know the story. Now Ruth meets Boaz in the grain field. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and pick up the leftover grain before anyone in whose eyes I find favor, behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." So they were doing this. They didn't have machines, so they're doing this, and they would leave part of the grain behind them. They didn't keep it all. And so the poorer people went out there and went behind people who let them, that's find favor, who let them, and they went out there and they picked up the pieces of wheat and the things like that. And they kept it. So they followed the harvesters. And it said, and Ruth said to Moabite, "Let me go to the fields." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out and entered the field and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. We've heard now this 33 times. Just as Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters, "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. What do we say in church every Sunday before I start the announcements? "The peace of the Lord be always with you." And you say, "And with thy spirit." If you're right one, you say, "And with thy spirit." If you're not, you say, "With you," and with you also, or something, whatever they say in right too. And it says, Boaz asked the overseer of his harvest, "Who does that young woman belong to?" Now it starts to get good. The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz went to Ruth, said to her, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water that the men have filled, water jar the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I have been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord." It's not a question, it's a statement. "May I continue to find favor in your eyes. You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." Let's stop here and talk about this just a minute, because it has to do with our reading, our gospel reading for today. We are in the middle, as you know, of we're almost at the end of the agro parables, as I call them, the agricultural parables, and today is the mustard seed. And there's another one, a little pinch of bread. It's a leavening part of bread. And what you will hear me say really briefly in the sermon today is that what we need to pay attention to is that in all of these agro parables and all of these things that Jesus told, God takes, it starts out with a little and becomes a lot in every one of them. Throw the seed on the ground, and do this and do that. And it's always a little. It ends up being a lot. And that is because God performs what?
Miracle.
Yes, a miracle. Yes. And so that is the same thing. And Jesus is telling us to do the same thing, you see. We're saying, but we don't have much. We're a small church. We only have 20 people who come on Sunday. We've only got 38 or 40 on our rolls. We are a small church. What can we do? We don't have an ability to do much. That's what we could think. But God, through the parables of his son Jesus, said, but if you have a little and you put it in my hands, it becomes a lot. When you give your offering every Sunday and you put it in the plate, and then the usher brings it up and gives it to either the deacon or to the subdeacon Mark, and they turn around to the altar, I bless it, and I say, the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, take this offering and multiply it to the use of God's kingdom. Or I may change it a little bit, but that's it. That's what we do. God tells us to give him our little, and he takes it and makes it his lot. Haven't you heard that before? Of course you have. We've all heard that before. But it's good to remember it, and that's what these parables are really about. The parables are not really about. Jesus is talking to these people. I'm telling you more than I'm going to say today. But these people, he talks to them in language they understand, which is agriculture. That's what they understand. But that's not why that's not what the parable is really about. The parable is about letting God perform miracles with the little that we have. And that, were you going to say something, John? Oh, okay. And that goes on into the rest of our lives, doesn't it? We have issues, we have problems, we have illness, we have money problems, we have this, we have that. We have grandchildren, we have great-grandchildren that are on the wrong path. We do all these things. And what we do is we pray for God to take what we have here as a problem and perform a miracle with it. Isn't that what we're asking? Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's the wonder of God. That is the miracle-giving life that God has for us. And people say, oh, I've never had a miracle happen to me. When they're thinking of miracles, they're talking about these big, water into wine miracles. That's not the kind of miracles God's really in the business of performing. Jesus performed that miracle so that people would know who he was and to make his mother shut up. But that's what he really did. He did the water into wine. But what we're really talking about is everyday miracles. Everyday miracles. Recently, the vestry met to come up with a financial package for your new rector. And I will be honest with you and tell you that I thought there wouldn't be much hope that it would be enough money to have a good choice. I just thought that. That was just my thinking. Because I heard people say, oh, let's get somebody who's retired from the service or whatever it was. I was wrong. The vestry came back with what I consider to be a fantastic, excellent financial package to get a good rector here. And I'm so proud of them. and so proud of Ed leading them, and so proud of the way it turned out. I can't tell you how proud I am. God took what could have been a little, because the vestry could have said, we're a small church, we don't have a lot of money, we can't do a lot. He took it, and with the vestry, multiplied it into a large amount. For what I think is for this parish, a large amount. And it is a miracle. It's a miracle. When Tom called me to come back here for the church, they stepped out in faith and said, we're going to run a deficit budget for these years until we get enough people. Well, we didn't grow enough. What we did was grow. We replaced all the people who left. We kept even, but we didn't grow. So that part didn't work out. But on the other hand, we've done a lot of other things that we never saw coming in this church. And those are miracles. Those are small miracles. And so, actually, there's no small miracle. There's either a miracle or there's not a miracle. I'm just saying to you, when you think that something is not a miracle, if there's no other explanation for it, God's behind it. That's all I'm saying. Okay, let's go back to, there's the deal right there. Let's go back to them. So he says, she says, can I continue to find favor? When she said, at the mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine and vinegar. It was early salad, you know. When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over as she got up to glean. Boaz gave orders to his men, let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she thrashed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town. 30 pounds is ephah, about 30 pounds. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law, Naomi, asked her, where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. The name of the man I work with today is Boaz, she said. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, that man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers. Guardian/redeemers. We're going to come back to that in just a minute. Then Ruth said to Moab, he even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting my grain. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvest were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So that's part of where we are right there. Now let's talk about this guardian redeemer. It's up at the top of the page. This is not a Jesus redeemer. We're not talking about the same kind of thing. Naomi recognizes God's kindness in the person of Boaz as one of her guardian redeemers. The Hebrew word jael, which translates to close relative, in some translations means to redeem. Such relatives were redeemers because they had a legal obligation of the law of Moses to redeem or buy back from the foreclosure the property of destitute relatives. The close relative could then redeem various types of obligations through a monetary payment. Individuals could reclaim their land or house. An indentured servant could be redeemed from servitude. A religious offering could be reclaimed. Yet some redemptions were not made with a sum of money. The closest male relative of a murdered Israelite was a blood redeemer. This avenger of blood was required to avenge the blood of the dead kinsman with the life of the murderer. The closest adult male relative of a deceased person was required to ensure the economic welfare of the deceased kin. In this case, the legal custom of the close relative was very similar to another legal custom. The Levirate marriage. What's the Levirate marriage? Levites, they're who? The priests. Priests, the holy people. The close relative was to continue in the name of the deceased male relative by legally acquiring the dead man's wife. The children of the new union then inherited the property of the deceased, the former husband. Naomi hoped that Boaz would accept his dual responsibility as her close relative. One responsibility was to redeem Naomi's land, which she sold in her destitute condition. Yet a second responsibility was to marry Naomi's daughter-in-law, Ruth, continuing the name of Ruth's dead husband. And we haven't gotten to that part yet. But this is called the guardian redeemer. And I think, and maybe you have your thoughts on it, this is a good practice. We've gotten away from this, of course.
Cleaning?
No, guardian redeemer. Guardian redeemer. Did you say redeeming? I'm sorry.
I said gleaning.
No, gleaning was the following along. No, a guardian redeemer. And I'll tell you how this sort of happened. This is just me, but remember when we were younger and our parents were still alive and our grandparents were ill or old and they didn't have anywhere to live because their husband had died and there was a grandmother. And remember what happened? They took them into the house. Do you remember that? Maybe yours didn't, but you knew people who did. They took them into the house, or your great-grandmother. And she came and lived in the house where you were a little child. And it was like having this special Nana, Nana, who was there sort of, who was this woman of wisdom who knew things and who looked after you because you didn't hire babysitters and nannies. That was all done in-house, in family, in familia, they called it. And so they used to do that. And then what happened to change that?
Nursing home.
Yes, nursing homes.
I didn't want to say old age homes.
Well, or retirement centers, retirement homes, or whatever you want it to be. Because here's what, and what caused that? Let's go back one step further. What caused that?
Women went to work.
That's one thing,
And
absolutely.
nuclear families disintegrated. People started moving away.
That's it. The people didn't live in their hometowns anymore. How many of you have can say Kerrville is your hometown? There you go. People moved, and kids moved away. They went to school, and they went to, usually they went to big cities for a while at least, but they went where they had a job, and they got paid, and they started their career, because in the little small town, there weren't enough jobs. Or they didn't want to run the tire shop that their parents and grandparents had run all their lives, Tom had a business. He sold his business. His kids didn't work in his business. Well, but not now.
Yeah, he owns it.
He owns it. You sold it to your son.
No,
I'm sorry.
it's a longer story, but no.
He owns it, and then somebody else runs it or something. Whatever.
He runs it. He's part of a billion-dollar corporation now, not a
Okay.
$1 million one. So
You sold it, but you sold it to him or gave it to him or whatever you did. But most of us don't have family that work in the business.
When I grew up in Chicago, my family, both sides, all lived probably in walking distance of each other.
Yeah.
And then the other relatives, where you knew everybody, and they all lived within
Yes.
a walking distance of each other. And I'm not just talking my grandparents, but great-grandparents and
Uncles.
Cousins.
uncles, aunts, other sides of the family where they,
And you had big
We
family
knew it.
dinners.
oh yeah, we knew everybody in the family.
Yeah.
And extended out.
And they lived there all their lives.
Was that?
They lived there all their lives.
Yeah.
Well, the older ones.
Yeah.
They weren't going to move.
No.
Now, let me ask you, you came from a more different background than down here. A lot of people in Chicago and up in the north, they had union jobs.
Right.
And then their sons had union jobs after them. They got them to follow them when they were old enough, they got them a job.
Right.
And they went to the union job. And it was it went for generations.
Right. I was of the generation that most of us didn't do that.
Yes.
And like my father,
But you could have.
yes, but they couldn't understand why
You didn't want
we didn't want to be in the union job.
That's
What's
what I
wrong
mean.
with you?
You could have, you just didn't want to do it.
Well, we see now there are avenues.
Yeah, I get it, but I mean, but they wanted you to.
Oh, yeah, we were,
They had the job right there for you.
Yeah.
See, that's the thing. So in a case like that, like Mark's father, he's sort of a guardian redeemer.
Right.
This idea that we had these, I didn't grow up. My father had 3 grocery stores, but he died when I was 5, and they were still in my mother blind, so she sold them. If my dad had lived, he would have wanted, and I might have, been a grocer. Can you imagine that?
Yes.
I had unfettered access to
There went the
money.
prophets. There went the prophets.
There were the prophets.
I didn't say it. I just say
You just okay. Yeah, mistakes would have been, But you know what? My dad did that. I remember him always bringing home at the end of the day. He'd get home late because they were open late. He'd get home and he'd come in with that butcher paper wrapped and give it to my mother, and that's what we'd have for dinner, whatever it was. Didn't know wasn't necessarily a steak, but whatever it was, that's what we'd have for dinner. And the men around the next door to my father's main store was Shaw Pharmacy, and his son was my best friend growing up. And his grandfather and his father both had Shaw Pharmacy, and across the street, across the big street, was Hampton Vaughn Funeral Home, where I started working in 1973. And they all went at noon, they all went to Shaw Pharmacy and had lunch at the counter.
Yeah.
Or they went over there and had coffee in the morning or in the afternoon. At 5 or 6 o'clock or whenever they were through, they all went to my father's store, and they went back behind the meat counter to where his office was, and there was sawdust back in those days on the deal. And my mother, of course, had never had a sip of alcohol in her life and didn't allow it in the house. And so they would all go over there, and my father would bring out a bottle of whiskey of some sort, and they'd all have a glass of whiskey back behind the meat counter at my father's house every day, at father's store every day. I didn't know this. This is what my uncles and people told me about the stories, that my mother was mad that they told me these stories, because she wanted me to think that my father never did anything that was not exactly perfect in her eyes. So anyway, this guardian redeemer thing is important because we carry it through Holy Scripture in different ways. So what we want to do, and I won't be with you probably, but as you hear stories in church, you hear the readings in church. When you hear about, and so lived with so and took care of so or so did this and watched after so whatever it was, those are guardian redeemer situations. And that was a better way, I think. And so here's the thing. This is another example of what God put there for us to do that we have gotten away from. Does that make sense to you? Now, I'm not saying you have to work at the like you did. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that in our family units, if we still had those family units where everybody lived together in the towns and they were blocks away, would that not, if it could be, it's not, but if it could be, because America grew and people moved away and colleges came up and everybody went off to school and, all the stuff. But God intended for us to work and live in units. That's why there were, what, in Israel? 12 tribes. Exactly. He wanted us to do that. But we, knowing better, as we always think we do, spread out. It didn't matter what your job was. What mattered was that we took care of one another. So now, what do we have as a way of taking care of one another that we didn't have then? What?
Hospitals, nursing homes.
But those people are paid.
Oh,
Let me take one more chance. What unit is there to help take care of each other?
Church.
You got it.
What do you say?
Church.
Oh.
Church. We are here to take care of one another, love one another, care for one another, think the best of one another. When people are sick, we take them food, we go see them, we call them. We have taken the place of the family unit that used to all live together. Does that not make sense? So who are we in that case? Our church. Yes! Congratulations. There we go.
Right.
You got them all. You got them right. So we'll finish Ruth next time, I think. But that's sort of where we got in Ruth, because I wanted to go into this guardian redeemer, because I want you to know who you are. You are guardian redeemers of one another. That's who we are.
Yeah, 2 weeks ago when we weren't here, anyway, to see your beard, we were at a family reunion, and we are the patriarchs of the family now. So it's right along that story.
Yeah.
You
have to make sure that everybody's okay.
Right, and they make sure I'm okay.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a.
My brother and I had the privilege of having not only our father, but his brother and sister work in our business.
I mean, and some of your children did.
And cousins.
And cousins and people. See, I mean, it's just changed. And you had the privilege, Mark, of, on Sunday after Mass going down and having these tables full of relatives and these women making food that was just out of this world that I wish I could have now, and that you've made a little of. And, I don't know how you grew up, John, but.
Well, my stepfather, before my mother would marry, made him go back to his family in Delphos, Ohio. And they went back. His brother was a union worker, and he was in management. We'd get together, and my grandfather was sitting there drinking the tequila we brought from Mexico for him.
Oh my gosh.
And they'd be arguing labor
Yeah.
and sit there and argue with one another, and Grandpa would just sit there and drink that tequila, and
There you go.
when it was over he couldn't hardly walk.
Well, you didn't have to walk.
I was a little kid, I slept with Grandpa that night, he didn't move.
All right, we'll finish Ruth.
Just gonna say, we have pictures of Mark's family together. There'd be 4 of the old playpens with 4 or 5 kids in each one.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I know, fourth cousins.
Yeah.
I know,
And I have cousins that live in Texas and Louisiana, New Orleans, and I've been to New Orleans a dozen times, and I've never looked them up. And I have cousins that live here and from my father's family, but he died so young. I was so young. I know who they are. I could have looked them up. I could have gone to see them. I lived in Austin with one right there. I just never thought about it. Because my family was not that way like you all.